Welcome to our class on the 4 stages of strategic mold avoidance. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with the Exposing Mold team, Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, I am the founder of Exposing Mold and also a licensed acupuncturist and herbalist. And Alicia is the vice president of Exposing Mold. She is the brainchild of all of our marketing, the connoisseur of all podcast development and scheduling the best interviews. And she also is like the master at keeping Eric and I on track for Exposing Mold. And then we have Eric. For those of you who do not know Eric Johnson has a really unique background and a very interesting story that actually is at the foundation of the development of the mold avoidance strategies. Eric Johnson has a very unique place in history where he was the very first prototype of chronic fatigue syndrome. And if anyone here isn't familiar with some of the basics of chronic fatigue syndrome, what happened was in the 80s in Lake Tahoe, all of the buildings that were a little bit bad simultaneously got way worse to the point where nobody was really pointing at moldy buildings, and then everyone was pointing at moldy buildings, making them sick. He started using his own biological warfare training after he got sick to kind of discern what was happening, and he created the theory of the effect. The effect is the theory in which strategic mold avoidance is built upon, and it's also the theory that he created to explain why all the buildings in Lake Tahoe went bad simultaneously. We often see this referred to as like bad building practices or tighter buildings or new building practices. And when this first started happening of all buildings going bad, there was actually something else going on environmentally. So Eric was asked to be the first prototype of chronic fatigue syndrome by the doctors who called the CDC in to investigate this mystery illness. When all of the buildings went bad, a virus also came through town. And what happened was people who were in or exposed to bad buildings didn't recover and develop this new sensitivity. So it seems as if the history of chronic fatigue syndrome coincides with the development of this mold hypersensitivity. But since the CDC never fully investigated it and connected this to mold, chronic fatigue syndrome and mold hypersensitivity have never been formally linked. There is so much misinformation about what chronic fatigue syndrome is, including people say that there's many causes of chronic fatigue syndrome. It's actually an unsolved medical mystery that was thought to be originally chronic EBV. So reactivated EBV that wouldn't go into remission was originally thought to be the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. And the reason Eric was chosen to be the first prototype is because his blood was taken and he was EBV negative. And he was referred to as the pristine cases. And there were 19 cases of this chronic illness that were EBV negative, which debunked the chronic EBV theory. And the residual evidence was other things that were never fully formally tied to mold or fully investigated. And so Eric had no support in recovery at a time where there was no mold doctors, no public acknowledgement of mold illness. He was forced to rely on his biological warfare training to come up with a strategy that he used to recover medication-free, surgery-free, and that is how strategic mold avoidance was born. Today, we're going to cover the origin of how and why mold avoidance was created, the 4 stages of strategic mold avoidance, some myths surrounding mold avoidance, and then the benefits of mold avoidance.
So, I hate to be morbid here, but this is just the reality of the situation. I've seen people die time and time again because they've been deprived of information that could have saved their lives. Avoidance is basically a placeholder method until science catches up to the reality of someone who's been made hypersensitive from molds. Unfortunately, at this time, there's no cure for hypersensitivity, just like there isn't a cure for someone who has a peanut reactivity, which is something that we like to often compare. We know that providing avoidance information isn't a moneymaker for the American Medical Association or even for alternative practitioners, because our main focus isn't on selling pills or supplements or treatments. So what the medical establishment is doing is, frankly, is criminal. They know about mold. They know it can harm, but because of its complexities, important information like avoidance is being kept from the masses. And that is why we are here to deliver information on how to pursue strategic mold avoidance. So strategic avoidance definitely is something that you could try in order to help regain your health. Would just like to pose this to you guys. How would you treat a sick fish? And there's many theories out there, and this is kind of what we see what doctors do to people who are sick, right? So theory 1, you medicate the fish. Theory 2, you treat the water. Theory 3, you blame the fish's genetics. Or theory 4, you tell the fish that they're under too much stress and their symptoms are psychological. How about theory 5? Just get out of the dirty fishbowl and get into a clean one and see how you do.
So just to intro mold avoidance, people criticize mold avoidance for a lot of reasons, and we understand why that this really wouldn't be the first thing that people look at. I mean, people are really conditioned to chase their doctors for medications for a diagnosis. The medical system has civilians fairly trained, like any disorder, any ache and pain, any health complaint, like that's where you go to seek the advice and the treatment. And so when Eric recovered from mold avoidance and started telling people about it, naturally that caused a little bit of a disruption in people's thinking. And the opposition is like, well, not everyone can just go to the desert and heal. Well, here's a spoiler alert. Eric never told anyone to go to the desert to heal. It's just what he did. He happened to have a desert that was like within driving distance to where he lived when he was really sick. So when he needed to go somewhere and get fresh air, that's just where he went. And he noticed that he felt a lot better there. And then people hearing this story in retrospect are like, oh, well, then we have to go to the desert and we have to live in RVs and we have to travel. And that's not necessarily what he was saying. What he was saying is, I'm noticing this effect. And if I avoid this effect, my body actually begins to heal. That's not the same as go to the desert. You don't have to, okay? People just kind of started copying the concept and promoting it. And when people got a little like success in terms of recovering their health, you know, they're repeating some of the things about where you have to go. But really, it's not necessarily a location, it's a strategy. And the strategy was based on what he learned in his biowarfare training. So before we dive into that, we're going to talk just briefly about some signs and symptoms of mold hypersensitivity. These are common conditions that come up for people that are mold hypersensitive, but these conditions have different names, so people are not always contributing these conditions as a factor of mold hypersensitivity. But if you have a long-term exposure or even a short-term exposure that was severe enough to make you sick, really any kind of mold exposure can cause hypersensitivity. My opinion is it's probably more the type of mold that's causing the hypersensitivity than it is anything else, based on the type of injury that some molds can cause. And so that can look like a newer developed multiple chemical sensitivity, or developing like histamine reactions or food intolerances, immune system failure that begins to look like reactivated viruses, chronic infections, recurring infections, nervous system disorders like dysautonomia, neurological issues. Cardiac issues are a really big one, and we have a lot on cardiac issues in our Patreon group, because we at Exposing Mold think the cardiac issues are kind of the heart of the matter here with mold hypersensitivity. Autoimmune conditions are commonly diagnosed when someone is mold sick, so maybe like a misdiagnosis of mold hypersensitivity. We covered the food allergies, POTS I'd categorize as cardiac, fatigue, and honestly, so much more. There's so many symptoms you can tie back to mold sensitivity.
Yeah, during the Cold War, I was stationed in northern Germany in a bunker built as Hitler's forward headquarters for the invasion of Great Britain, Operation Sea Lion. We had a mold incident there, and a lot of us got sick. In fact, my nuclear missile unit was the first frontline active duty nuclear missile unit that was removed from the active duty roster for sheer rate of illness. And it appears that it had something to do with that black mold that was growing down in the basement of this bunker, down in the armory, all over the cardboard boxes. I got horribly sick there. And it's kind of hard to see while I'm wrenching on the back of this missile here, but I've got a piece of tissue hanging out my nose because I had constant nosebleeds, headaches, and could barely function. I found that if I got away from the unit for a little while, I felt much better. So that's essentially how I decided that I needed a change in location to control whatever it was that was going on. And this medal that I'm wearing here is the 1977 Nijmegen Volksmarch medal. I actually volunteered just as a means to get away from my garrison for a while and found that as long as I was on this march, carrying a 30-pound pack, marching 25 miles a day, I was doing great. I was unstoppable, where I'd get back to the unit and could barely stand up. So that's sort of the origin of mold avoidance. And thanks to being educated in radiological, biological, and chemical warfare, I started viewing this in terms of how an immune suppressant would be applied or how a radiologically contaminated area might affect people and how moving locations would resolve some of the strange infections that would crop up. My first biological warfare training lesson, the instructor, the first thing he said was that low-level immune suppressors can be applied to an environment to harass a population or the enemy. And the prevailing attitude, not knowing that this was happening, would be that there was nothing wrong and they would defend that principle. This sort of leads to the mass formation psychosis, where everybody's reassuring each other that nothing is wrong. And if you step out of line by trying to say that there is, the majority will work against you. And this applied to doctors, where if they saw infections acting in a strange way, just common cold or fungal infections or anything that was normally something easily controlled by the immune system would crop up, they would dismiss it as being nothing unusual. So they would actually serve to suppress the fact that something was going on because of their attempts to deny that there was anything unusual happening. The nerve agents would not only suppress the immune system and make people act kind of bizarre, but it would inhibit their ability to detect that something was wrong. So it would all add into the problems with finding out that these immune suppressing agents had been applied. Now, we were taught that the chemical detection systems are very crude. They're not going to be everywhere. So in order to survive in the battlefield post-biological warfare environment, you need to rely on your own observations. You need to really trust that you see is really happening, detect something out of the ordinary. If it's noteworthy, something that's a threat, according to your conceptual framework, evacuate, decontaminate, take a shower, remove your gear and make sure that it's washed, get new gear, stack up your contaminated equipment in an isolation area, and make sure that your sleeping area is clear of any possible contamination. Now, of course, this is all very bizarre. It's not part of our societal thinking. So it leads to this epistemic intolerance where, just as pointed out earlier with the mass formation psychosis, a backlash occurs. People actively try to suppress the very clues you need to find out that something wrong is happening. So all this adds up to sort of a mob mentality, a bunch of different factors all coming together to try to suppress the idea that anything unusual is going on. It's also called groupthink. And it may not be societal brainwashing per se, it just happens automatically because we're not used to unusual things going on.
Can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
Is this kind of like what we're referring to when we say how like incorrect ideas are also spreading among patient base, where it's like somebody just hears something and then they're just repeating it as fact, like the mass formation of kind of like incorrect information that's just accepted as fact.
Yeah, in any situation, the most powerful elements will emerge to shape how the group thinks about things. And of course, that's going to be the academics, the doctors. These are going to be the people that you look to for guidance. And when your academics, when your doctors, when your researchers are the ones in denial, then it leads to the entire group following their thought leaders and only serving to suppress the few people who notice that something really bizarre is going on that is outside of the norm that needs some attention paid to it. So my instructors in biological warfare training were explicit that when doctors notice a common cold affecting people more, that they would try to stretch whatever agent, infection, anything they find to fit what they're seeing. They will only blame what they can find on tests and stretch it. They will say, well, you must have done something wrong. You've got poor genetics. You've got bad diet choices. Something is wrong with you. And they will elevate this level of thinking to a form of active denial to help suppress the idea that, no, these infections shouldn't be doing this. Normal, healthy adults shouldn't have chronic active Epstein-Barr virus. You shouldn't have cytomegalovirus or common fungal infections, toenail fungus. You shouldn't have these problems, especially in a large group all at the same time. And yet this is what doctors would be counted on to do, is blame whatever they find and focus on that, almost turn it around against you, so that if you have anything unusual, the more you bring it to their attention, the more they work against you.
Under a biological warfare attack, doctors would blame only what they can find on tests. And this is something that sticks with me because I just remember asking you, how did they know? How did your army people, your trainers, know that doctors would behave this way? And your answer kind of cracked me up, because I know you said that you asked and they basically told you to like mind your own business and stop asking questions.
Yeah, I asked them if they'd actually carried out tests to find this out. And that's where they told me, Johnson, you asked too many questions.
But I mean, that's an uncanny prediction from biological warfare training.
We always often make fun of military intelligence, but for this, they absolutely nailed it. Nerve agents, as an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, cause strange patterns of behavior and derail the neurological functions of the brain so badly that it actually ruins the very portion of the brain that can use logic to determine what is happening to you. And they said, in a nerve agent exposure, the slightest whiff of nerve gas will cause people to go into an instant denial, an absolute denial, an unreasoning negation of the idea that anything bizarre is happening. And if they see somebody who's slightly affected, they see everybody else putting on their gas masks, they will actually get angry and try to talk you into removing your gas mask. And if they get close to you, they would actually try to rip your gas mask off just to prove to you that nothing is going on. This is such a predictable part of what happens with nerve agent exposure that we were told, never approach somebody by yourself to try to get them to put on their gas mask, because they will more than likely try to rip yours off. So this was something they anticipated in neurological agent exposure, is that people would not have a logical and rational denial or doubt, uncertainty that something is going on, that it would be unreasonable and it would be a blind rage. And this too is something that I saw with the neurotoxic agents coming from Stachybotrys, that people went into this unreasoning denial. So this seemed to match what I was being trained for. So the trainers were saying that the human mind has a tendency to try to chemicalize or intellectualize their way out of a problem, figure out some magic pill, some device, some formula that will just somehow straighten out the situation. And they were very clear. They said, after this training, you will not do that. You will use your senses to detect something abnormal going on. You will evacuate the area and decontaminate as quickly as you can. And as part of this, because the most common biological agents would be deployed by artillery strikes, this would create a puff of smoke. Usually that wouldn't match the same color as a regular artillery round, possibly white or different colors. And you would look for this and you would check the wind direction to make sure that if you saw any strange smoke blowing into your area, if it was blowing down on you, you could move laterally and get out of it. And even if you weren't aware of the strike itself, the way to warn people of a nerve agent event in the Army is to bang on metal. So everybody just grabs something metal and starts beating on the closest thing to make a sound. And by the progression of the sound, you would be able to tell that the agent was coming from a certain direction. And this would go along with the wind. So you always stop and check the wind direction. First thing, of course, after you put on your gas mask, but look at which way the wind is blowing so that you can make predictions about which way the agent is heading, who's going to be affected next, and what direction you have to go, which is the shortest way to get laterally out of whatever's coming at you. And this seems to hold true for mold colonies as well, because when they're putting out a plume of toxic spores, if you know that they're directly upwind of you, you may have to go a considerable distance downwind to get out of the plume, whereas sideways, a few steps might be sufficient. So here in the epistemic intolerance that I talked about, there seems to be a need for people to work through a stage of denial before they can break through and finally admit that something is really going wrong that needs their attention. There's a stage in which people balance what they see a number of times against their denial, against their hope that nothing is going wrong. And you kind of go back and forth between denial and acceptance. And this can happen in stages where you're uncertain about it. So at the beginning, you might trust your observation, but once you get clear of it and it's no longer a threat, you wonder, did that really happen? So there's sort of a seize and freeze on acceptance that something really did happen. And it takes a number of repetitive experiments before you can finally move into full acceptance that something is going wrong and stay in a state of mind that, yes, whatever you perceive is real. And my trainer said that the military, the enemy, they are always working on new agents to confuse people. And for this purpose, they'll mix and match all kinds of existing agents. And if something new crops up, then you have to fit this into the conceptual framework of what you already understand to look for something that doesn't quite fit what you've already been trained for. And in the mold situation, the first thing that really cropped up, aside from the effect itself, was that this was easily transported on clothing and in hair and kept people sick. And society had no apparent knowledge of any mold that could be transported in this way and continue to be a driving force in illness. So in the 1980s, when people were so certain that they knew all about mold, that it was an allergy, this stood out as something that was really bizarre, people would evacuate from a moldy building, not quite knowing what toxins were involved, just knowing that they had to get out, but they would take their possessions with them and find that they could not recover. And here was a clear situation of something that did not fit what they were absolutely certain they were going to experience. So that's really where the toxic mold phenomenon started, is with the realization that what we were perceiving, not yet testable by any known science, just what we were anecdotally reporting, didn't remotely fit what we were predicting was going to happen.
So it seems like we're still at that stage, right, Eric, that we're at this stage where, yeah, we progressed, right? At one point, initially it was an allergy. Then, we started looking at it from a toxicological point. You got to get these toxins out of the body. Some of these molds can cause infections. We're at a different juncture now, though, however, correct? We're at this immune system reprogramming effect that we're seeing in the hypersensitive population that is not still recognized by mainstream doctors.
Yeah, medical science hasn't really looked into this, and we're still struggling with the epistemic intolerance, a backlash. You can see that even mold experts are saying, well, all molds are the same. Don't attach importance to any particular mold. They're kind of fighting back, just as the military predicted society would. And we fluctuate back and forth on some of these interesting clues that we see, one of which is that the contaminated objects could continue to be a driving force in people's illness. And another is that this isn't acting like any normal toxin would. It's definitely not like an allergy. Some people are not recovering even after they're removed from exposure. They become hypersensitive. They're able to point in the direction of a colony, which is kind of bizarre. And this lack of recovery also challenges what we believed that we could expect from a chemical exposure. So there seems to be some kind of immunological reprogramming going on that is still being overlooked, because doctors are so certain that if you get people away from the chemical, eventually they are bound to recover.
Yeah, so that's where, I feel like a lot of people rely on these urine mycotoxin tests to see how much of the mycotoxin chemical they have within their body. But what we need to understand is there's so many people that take these urine analysis, they'll take a before and after, they'll show some result, then they'll show their after with no result, but they're still sick. And that's where that immune system reprogramming can be coming in.
This is really common. We mold hypersensitive people can detect when we are in a bad location. And very often we'll walk into a bad building, or there will be a change in the weather, and others will start to complain. And when asked, the first thing they do is say, I'm fine. This is nothing. It's just me. And we, because of our ability to observe that it's something happening in the environment, can tell it's not just you. You went into denial there. It's a sort of an automatic way to pass off something that's not really accepted by society, simply because they don't understand it. When we get a bunch of hypersensitive people together, we understand it extremely well.
This was so refreshing during the mold tour when, it was me and you, Eric, and then we had another individual, and we'd go through these situations and we'd all look at each other and say, did you feel that? And we would say, yeah. Or does this item feel bad to you? And we would all say, yeah. And in a way, it's so weird to feel validated in that sense of being around people who can validate that for you and who are also going through it as well, because it's such a flip of the coin when you're dealing with your family who are not as affected. You feel something and they don't, and you just kind of have to keep it to yourself. So the mold tour has been really amazing and validating for that.
Yeah, in 1955, a famous outbreak of a mystery illness happened at a London hospital, the Royal Free Hospital. And this was sufficiently different from existing entities that were entered into the medical literature that the doctors at the Royal Free Hospital felt that they were on safe ground in creating a new name, a new definition for something that was slightly different, or at least conceptually different than what they had seen before. They were trying to narrow the evidence base, increase the clues, bring things up to a more understandable level in creating this new name of myalgic encephalomyelitis. And one of the things that was reported in this mystery malady is that people would commonly suffer relapse from a change in the weather. Even though no sick buildings were reported in myalgic encephalomyelitis, and they certainly didn't write down mold anywhere that we can find it, we know that toxic mold does release, it does amplify, it increases its power at times of weather change and when the seasons change. So this might be a possible link between myalgic encephalomyelitis and environmental illness. When I talk about an effect, I resorted to this terminology because when we say toxin, that immediately creates a framework of thinking this is some kind of chemical agent. And we're not certain that everything we feel is purely chemical. There seems to be an electrochemical factor going on, something that science doesn't quite understand yet. And this seems to be brought out by changes in the atmospheric electricity and a few other subtle clues, such as the way people walking past a wall that has a hidden mold colony can turn around and point at it. Now, people who say that this is strictly a matter of spores and fragments say that there's no directionality to it. If you go into a spore plume, you will feel that you're in it, but you won't be able to tell which direction it's coming from. And even if you knew what the wind direction was, that might give you a vector, some means to point upwind, but that still wouldn't let you know that there's actually something hidden behind a wall. So this peculiar ability of people to get close to a very powerful toxic mold colony and point directly at it suggests that there's something deeper than just a chemical agent going on here, some kind of electrostatic effect that we can sense. And in order to bring attention to this, I had to stop using the word toxin or referring to it as a chemical, because once people lock that in their mind, then they're no longer open to thinking this as an electrochemical reaction.
I want to speak up here because I want to share that story about my turning point and being able to begin to conceptualize this as an effect over a toxin. We did record a podcast on this, but for anyone who missed it, I screened the house that I'm currently living in using my senses, and I didn't react to it when we first saw it to put the offer on it or when we did the inspection. But after living here for a little bit, I noticed I was having problems by my oven. And I was having very intense mold reactions by my oven. For me, that looked like while I was cooking and the heat was on the stovetop, I was suddenly getting the immediate like heart pain, faster, harder beating heart, and feeling an anxious feeling like I had to run. And for me, that's a common experience when I'm in a fairly bad exposure. I'll start feeling the heart stuff and like I have to get out of that area. And it was very specific to when the stove was on, and I could not figure this out. I was looking for hidden mold everywhere in the kitchen, and I couldn't find any. And there was a stain in one of the cabinets, but when I opened it, I didn't smell a mildew smell, I didn't smell a mold smell, whatever it was that was hidden, I couldn't detect it. My mom came over, who has like more multiple chemical sensitivities, like a very strong increased smelling ability. And I said, can you check this cabinet and just see if you smell like a musty odor in here? Because there's this stain here and I don't know what's going on. I'm reacting in the kitchen. She could smell a mold odor very clearly from that cabinet. So I had my husband rip the cabinet out of the kitchen and we got rid of it. After that, when I used the stove, I no longer had reactions. So there was a cabinet with hidden dormant mold that I could not detect with my nose nor with my sensing abilities because it wasn't acting up. But something with using the oven made this mold act up. The mold by itself wasn't bothering me. The oven by itself doesn't bother me, or I should say the stove top doesn't bother me. But the combination felt like it was going to kill me. And this is when I got to the point where I was like, what is this happening? This is so much more than just toxins and mycotoxins affecting my brain or affecting my heart. This is so specific to when I turn on the stove. And I just wanted to share that because I think it's a really interesting example of the effect versus like the toxins. And it's not just an EMF sensitivity, I want to clarify, because I'm not sensitive to the oven top now. Me and Eric almost divorced over that disagreement, I want everyone to know. Because I could not understand what he was saying. And it's a source of conflict. You know, his whole entire theory is on the theory of the effect, and every single person is talking about it in terms of toxins. How do you even have a conversation at that point? The conversation's going to break down. But it's this electrochemical phenomenon that Eric's going to talk about right now that is the effect.
It's amazing that prior to the development of the viral theories for chronic fatigue syndrome, there was an unusual concept where modern life was stealing our electrons. I know you have to dive really deep into the old literature to find this, because once the viruses became public, they really got everybody's attention. But there was a vague idea that was being studied by ion researchers that the ratio between positive and negative ions in the atmosphere was affecting our health. And something about modern pollution, modern chemicals was stealing our electrons. Well, I had this in mind at the time when all the chronic fatigue syndrome researchers were wrangling over their various viruses. And one thing I noticed is that my symptoms really got worse during the middle of the night, which I was told is the time when the ion ratio changes from positive in favor of negative ions. It's not like I'm a physicist or an ion researcher, but I was told this is the exact same time of night when the negative ions increase in prevalence. And I felt that somehow this was having an effect on whatever the environmental agent was that I was reacting to. So I started out immediately trying to correlate my symptoms to changes in the weather, to lightning storms, to the times of ion shift. And if you think about what happens when the weather changes, it's a whole lot of electrostatic activity as the storm is approaching, and a lot of molecular friction by the wind coming up and the molecules bouncing on and off each other. And this is called tribostatic friction. And it's generating a lot of electricity. I felt that if my symptoms were being amplified by this weather change phenomenon, this was a possible clue as to the nature of what's happening in the body, in the nervous system. And sure enough, we know that electrophoresis and the way electromagnetic fields dictate movements of agents in a colloid, in a liquid, do have an effect. And what are we, after all, but walking bags of electricity with a lot of electrochemical reactions going on? So when I've switched over to calling this an effect, it was an attempt to factor in these clues that we are highly influenced by these weather change triboelectric processes. and see if this could not only be used to help elucidate the etiology of whatever's going on in our bodies, but as a means of avoidance. Because if we can go out to the desert and the weather does whatever it wants and we don't feel anything, it shows that whatever is going on in the environment is lacking out there, and we get some relief from it. And this helps us seek out places that feel better, because at times of weather change, if a place affects us less or not at all, then it's not being amplified by the change in the weather phenomenon.
This slide was created to counter some of the information that we're seeing about mold illness really being limbic system damage at the root of it, and healing the trauma from the stress of the limbic system damage can reverse mold illness. And exposing mold does not frame mold illness this way. We don't buy into the idea that mold illness is limbic system damage. We do know that mold exposure can essentially cause a traumatic brain injury and cause damage in many parts of the brain, not just the limbic system. So one of the things that we say to emphasize this point is trauma does not cause mold illness, but exposure to mold or mold illness can cause trauma. We're not trying to be argumentative here, but this is really important for the hypersensitive population to understand, because a lot of times they're exposed to things that are still signaling reactions for them, and they think that they just need to calm their limbic system. So would you try to calm your limbic system if you had a peanut allergy? Or would you understand that your immune system has a reaction to peanuts and you really just have to stay away from peanuts?
And this idea that trauma and calming your runaway emotional responses is part of the epistemic intolerance that is pushing back against identifying specifically what this is. Because the more people that talk about shifting this into an emotional response, is the less focus on whatever this effect is.
So we've compared this illness to a peanut reactivity before, really to make the point that when something is going on with the immune system, you're not going to try to out-medicate it. You're not going to try to treat it. You're not going to try to do 58,000 tests to see what's wrong. You're going to understand that you have a peanut reactivity, but that same grace and understanding isn't applied to mold hypersensitivity. It's thought of as a different way, like mold is everywhere, mold can't do that. You're just traumatized. That's why you're overreacting. And we're here to say, no, we think mold hypersensitivity really is causing the symptoms that you're experiencing that feels like, mental health symptoms or stress symptoms, but because of the way that the body is being disrupted to cause that sensation, not because it's rooted in trauma or because it's not a real reactivity. It's as real as peanut reactivity. Eric, you had a really amazing story about actually almost hurting one of your higher ups in the Army because you had eaten a peanut butter sandwich. But the bottom line is that immune system damage is respected and acknowledged. Whereas if someone was going to die from a peanut allergy, you wouldn't like wipe peanuts all over your clothes and then go to their house and think that they're going to be okay. And this is some of the same thing that we struggle with mold hypersensitivity, with contamination on clothing. People are reacting to contaminated clothing, but then we look crazy because there's no mold growth. There's no visible mold. There's no spores that you could take off and test or detect, or mycotoxins, but still we're having this reaction to this item.
Yeah, that I was called in for disciplinary action, and I had just eaten a peanut butter sandwich, and I breathed the peanut molecules in my commanding officer's face, and he just about had a heart attack and died. He was lying on the floor, curled up in a ball. I thought I had killed him. It was incredible. I knew nothing about peanut allergy at the time, but since this happened at the exact same time, I was trying to work out my strange reactivity to mold, and I realized that minute exposures, contaminated objects were having this effect on me, that I was experiencing a kind of immune reprogramming similar to a peanut reactivity. So that became my model. When doctors talk about dose makes the poison, that is clearly not the case. for peanut reactivity. In terms of mold reactivity, they measure your dose of however much mold they think you've been exposed to and consider that to be the arbiter of whether you have the right to say mold is affecting you or not. Well, that doesn't apply to peanuts, and it doesn't apply to mold either. Somehow we've been triggered into a hyperreactivity that is beyond a dose response, and that is what they're not acknowledging.
This also goes along with mold testing. People will test their homes for mold. They'll see a few spores of toxic molds. And because it's only a few spores, according to the mainstream, you should be okay. There's nothing to worry. However, those few spores, if there was ever any located in that test, can cause a problem with someone who has been made hypersensitive for mold. So sometimes testing can be good, but it can also work against people. And we see that time and time again.
So before we dive into the 4 stages of strategic mold avoidance, I just want to talk a little bit about strategic mold avoidance and what it is and what it isn't. It seems like there's quite a few misconceptions about what strategic mold avoidance is or what mold avoidance really is in the way that Eric created it. And it doesn't seem like it's properly represented the way that it's discussed now. The way that it's discussed now is identifying toxins, traveling a lot to learn different toxin types. And the bottom line is Eric never created this to identify toxins, and identifying toxins or traveling to identify toxins was never the purpose of mold avoidance. The purpose of mold avoidance was always to have a strategy to avoid the feeling of the effect and understanding different factors that can cause the effect to feel worse or help you have some improvement with the effect. So the 4 stages of strategic mold avoidance include getting clear, we call this unmasking, managing intensification, navigating environments, and experimental assessment. So unmasking is the first stage where we are trying to get clear. So before we go into like, do you need to unmask? If you need to do mold avoidance, you need to unmask. If you're not sick enough to the point where you need to do mold avoidance, you're probably not watching this class. So getting clear is it's sometimes referred to as a sabbatical. And it basically is taking a break from your items in the location that's making you sick. So when you get clear, you're taking some time from a water damaged building. If you're super sick, you can assume your items are probably contaminated from that same environment, and you want to take a break from your items too. What this does is it kind of gives your immune system a chance to stop being bombarded by something that's making it sick. So that could be a bad location, it could be items, it could be a bad building. And Eric always says the purpose of mold avoidance is to identify an area that does not cause symptoms in times of weather change. Eric's like biggest clue about whether or not you're being affected by the effect is, do you have symptoms that can change with the weather? And that can be items that are contaminated actually amping up with a weather change, or a location that's bad amping up with a weather change, or a building feeling more worse with a weather change. And this is what he refers to as the amp up. Eric, do you want to speak at all about a sabbatical, like steps of a sabbatical? Because I know a lot of people have so many questions about how long should a sabbatical be? What can I bring with me? And they always want to hear specifically from you. And I'm just wondering if at this time you want to add anything about how to do a sabbatical or how to get clear.
Just that a lot of people discover this accidentally by taking a vacation, moving, noticing there was a change and wondering what it was. So the idea of getting clear was just to maximize your ability to make sure that you really do tell a difference by leaving your possessions behind and hopefully choosing the most pristine environment you can get to. Now, sometimes this hasn't always worked, and people have gone to a bad hotel, which made them so sick that they found out that this effect is real in reverse, because the fact that they went to a place that exacerbated their symptoms told them there was something there. So the question then was just, whether it was worse in the place they went to than in the place they came from. But even recognizing that was enough to let people know that there are environmental factors that we have to take care of.
Eric, I like that you said that a lot of people find this out on accident, because I actually unmasked on accident when I went from a building that was leaking to a building that was dry but had hidden mold. And then in a month from that time of relocating, went to another leaking building, and all of my symptoms that were really intense in the wet building flared up within 3 hours of being in this other wet building. And I realized it's here, there's mold here, and I'm getting sick again. And that was like how I encountered intensification, although I had no idea what it was. In my journey of getting clear moving forward, what I noticed was when we first left the mold, anytime that I was like re-encountering mold, I was having really severe reactions. And people tend to confuse this with getting worse after they leave, or they even think of it as not improving once they leave the mold, because they often don't understand how residual items from a moldy environment can result in this intensification. So an incomplete remediation, or a remediation that wasn't successful, or hanging on to your belongings, or being in an area that goes bad regularly, these are all going to keep you in this loop of intensification. So if you haven't gotten really clear, once you enter intensification, you might feel kind of confused about what's causing your reactions. And the way to kind of navigate that is anything that was from a moldy house, it really needs to be kept outside your living space and your sleeping space, because otherwise you stay in this hyperreactive state. Has that happened to either of you, Eric and Alicia?
Well, when I first got out to the desert with my camper, I was spending time away from my camper and realized that I couldn't go back to it. And the very thing that I drove out there that hadn't seemed completely intolerable on my way now became so bad I couldn't get within 30 feet of it. And this also clued me in that this was certainly not like an allergy, because all the doctors insisted that mold is an allergy, and the moment you get away, you'll start to improve. And this seemed to have an effect where you would actually become hypersensitive to the point where one single object would let you know that it was contaminated. Whereas you wouldn't be able to tell that with this very same object back in the place where it came from.
I find a lot of people have the question, like, do I really need to get clear of my items? Do I really need to not bring anything with me? Can I bring my phone? People who do bring items like phones or medications or computers, it is recommended that it's kept in a space outside of your sleeping space or living space. But intensification and getting clear, at least in my experience, can like loop back into each other. So there's a process of getting clear, and then you're in intensification where you're reacting very intensely to an item. And then those intensification reactions have been able to help me discern further contamination. And it's like the one big thing that might be bothering you a lot, and you get rid of that source point, and then it's like you think you're feeling okay, and then the next thing kind of bothers you a little bit, and the symptoms can be different. It can be a stomach ache, a headache, it can be neck pain, it can be digestive upset, it can be rage, which is a big one. I do wonder if sometimes people are confusing the variation of these symptoms and the looping between intensification of getting clear with like having to name all these different toxins of like, well, when I'm here and my stomach hurts, that's this toxin. Or if I'm doing this and this bothers me, that's this toxin. People who aren't naming and listing toxins and are just focusing on the effect have this still wide range of symptoms. We're not necessarily attributing to different toxins. Eric has taught us to attribute it to different degrees in how you're affected. How hard is the effect hitting you? How strong is the danger warning to get out of the area? And according to Eric, that's more of a clue of the variance of our symptoms.
I had an interesting situation happen to me where you're in this zone where you're super sick and you just figured out your house is making you ill. And we had left our home, brought all of our contaminated stuff in the back of the car. I was still sick, but not dying. But we got to a point where we were increasing in elevation. And all of a sudden, those contaminated items really hit me like very hard to the point where I thought I would have to call for an ambulance. And so it's like that goes back to even to the weather changing. It's like all these things can actually make these contaminated objects feel even worse. They may not have been bothering you or may have been bothering you at a low level, but these different changes in the atmosphere can really make these things feel intense. And so that's why it's so important to keep that stuff behind. Eric, while we were on the mold tour, I posed a question to you and I asked you, what is the reason for these varying symptoms when we go through intensification? And you gave a really good answer. And that made a lot of sense. Could you explain that, please?
It appears that we have many different receptors on our cells, and whichever ones are bound up the most are the ones that will result in the symptoms that are associated with that particular pathway. Now, this is just a theory. I don't know this for a fact. I know that different molds, and even the same mold, produce many different toxins, and they can have different concentrations at different times. You can go back to the exact same location that gave you heart palpitations one day, get more of a chemical sensitivity the next day. So there's variation in how the mold is producing these toxins. But it seemed to me that our sensitivity, once we're away, goes through a whole series of detoxification changes as these receptors that are, or as the ion channels that are bound up. It appears that the ion channelopathy is a major driver in how we perceive these toxins. And as the toxins leave our body, different receptors become unbound, and there could be a variation due to that.
The point that I like that you just made, Alicia, about how items can change properties based on the atmospheric changes in the weather, that is the effect that we're referring to. The fact that, how Eric just mentioned, there can be changes in the weather that causes the mold to produce more toxins. That is the effect. The fact that Alicia is mentioning contamination can have different properties day to day, that is the effect. You know, I think that it's really important to think about mold avoidance in terms of the effect and not toxins. There's some really experienced mold avoiders one in particular who reached out to me recently, and she's like, Keely, I don't understand how you're healing where you're living. I was not able to heal there and I got sick there. And I think this speaks to the requirement of always being consistent with getting clear, learning your reactions, and learning your reactions is part of what intensification teaches you. Because in my area, I have a very clear zone of like, this street's bad, this school's bad. When I go to this store, I have to decon. And if someone isn't clear enough to the point where they go to that store and they know that they feel something right there, you're going to walk through a plume, you're going to bring it home. Your kids are going to be in bad places and bad schools. They're going to bring it home all over them. You're not going to know to decon. And then this stuff is going to feel like it's everywhere. This is just an example from my specific situation, but it's important to the point of navigating environments. The whole entire point of getting clear and using your intensification reactions as a radar to help get away from what's bothering you is so that you can navigate your environments. In bad locations, there's good pockets of air. In good locations, there can be bad areas that you can react to. But once you get very, very comfortable in being able to discern your environments, contamination, your reactions, intensification, you are going to be a lot better at navigating environments. One complicating contributor that we talk about in terms of understanding environments is the Venturi effect. This has caused a lot of confusion amongst mold avoiders. We've seen mold avoiders have this common complaint where like everyone's air conditioning will feel bad and everyone will think that their air conditioning is moldy. Eric, do you want to explain what the Venturi effect is?
Well, I stumbled over this because I was grinding something in front of a hood, a fan that was drawing the dust away from my face. And I noticed that when a mold plume was coming through, when the whole area was acting up and I was feeling kind of bad, the area directly in front of this fan felt absolutely horrible. and it had a range to it. I could move in and out of a very specific range and feel that the accelerated air was somehow making these toxins more bioavailable. The zone was so discrete, had an absolute definite cutoff that I could tell by the way my heart would quit pounding as soon as I moved out of range. So I started doing experiments with vacuum cleaners, with fans, with HVAC systems, just moving air, and heaters in a car, and trying to look for clues as to how mold would act when it passed through a venturi. And it seemed like every time it would become vastly more bioavailable. So if I just step away from a vacuum cleaner or any place where this cloud of bioavailable toxins had been transformed by going through a venturi, I could avoid a tenfold amplification of how I would otherwise feel, even if the area itself was not perfect.
So how this translates into real life is if your air conditioner is bothering you, it could be that air conditioning blowing that air at possibly contaminated seats, and it's amping up the seats. Maybe there's not really mold in the air conditioner. Maybe your car's contaminated or you have contaminated items, and the air coming through at a faster speed is amping that up, changing the property. That is, the effect is changing. There's different atmospheric situations that can change the quality of the effect, and the Venturi effect is something that highlights that. If air is blowing through really fast and now something's bothering you that wasn't bothering you, it could be the Venturi effect. We've seen this question as a common question of someone in one of the mold avoidance groups. Why are all the dehumidifiers bothering me? Well, dehumidifiers blow out air. Was that amping up something that was in a bad area or had contamination by it? So air conditioners, fans, these things might be amping this up. And then just to add another layer of complexity, if you're in a good area, the wind could maybe blow something to you and blow something in on the wind. So something could literally be coming in on the wind, or increased rate of airflow could be amping up something that's already there. And those are the two ways that wind kind of exacerbates these symptoms. And it's also another reason why we need to be very good at discerning contamination, locations, environments, and areas so that we can use those skills to discern, did the wind blow something in, or is the wind amping something up? And how can I tell? Eric has actually taught Alicia and I how to use some concepts of the Venturi effect to detect contamination. So if we suspect an item is contaminated, we can actually use our own breath to breathe on it and then inhale really quickly and breathe again, and kind of do this rebreathe technique that Eric taught us to see if our hearts start to go pitter patter. And that's actually how we're able to test like clothing items. My son discovered this on accident. He was reacting to something in the closet and he said, "Mommy, I feel my heart beeping really hard." And we went in there together and we figured out what he was reacting to. And it was something I had reacted to in there too. So knowing that that's not necessarily anxiety when you feel your heart going is important also. Starting over in a good location is like having a blank slate, but you want to be careful not to contaminate that with underestimating how contaminated objects can make a good location feel like a bad location. If you're in a good location or in a good home and it suddenly doesn't feel good, that's a sign that you brought contamination in. Going to another house or a place in town can make figuring out what is bothering you difficult. That's one thing that I do think could be really confusing for the mold avoiders who are traveling. If you're constantly going into a different town where you have all these different factors, I don't know how you really master the getting clear and intensification. It took me, I would say, about a year and a half, like of doing this completely, just living and dying by this, to the point where I was able to say, okay, now I can actually draw a map in my town and tell you what streets to like stay away from. But I had to loop back through to intensification and getting clear. And it was a constant battle of discerning things that were bothering me, because I did make mistakes in bringing contamination in when I moved. I just cannot emphasize this enough, because it's the one thing that has kept me the most sick over the last 2 years, is really underestimating how contamination affects me. And then once I get it away from me, like how amazing I feel. The faster you can get clear, the faster you can develop these skills. And that's one thing that's great about the desert is it's such a pristine, great area with like no contamination, no bad sewers, nothing that people can blame for their reactions. You can get clear really quickly. So in a good environment, you can get clear really quickly. If you feel like you're not getting clear with your health, something's still not right with the environment. And if you're reacting constantly, there are hidden factors that you're reacting to, either in the location or the contamination that you haven't been able to discern yet, so you didn't get clear enough.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that it's about going to another house or place in town can make figuring out what is bothering you difficult. Well, when I went into a building I suspected or was certain was bad, after leaving, I would sniff my jacket, try to make sure that I wasn't carrying the contamination on me. If I have a reaction to my clothes or I just don't feel right, then I would assume that I was contaminated. If I didn't move out of a building and return to feeling as good as I felt before I went in the building, then I'd just go ahead and assume that I'm contaminated and take a shower, change my clothes.
That's one thing I've had to do once I was finally able to discern the worst areas in my town. Like now, if I go to the grocery store, if I go to the doctor, I know when I come home, I'm taking a shower, and I also know that the clothes that I wear in the house aren't going to be the clothes that I'm wearing outdoors to those places. Yeah, I think we just did a really good job covering the why of why recommending locations isn't really the focus of learning strategic mold avoidance. The strategy is what is important. If you focus on the location, you are not focusing on the strategy. The strategy is understanding intensification reactions, getting clear, and then staying away from the effect. It is not discerning toxins, it is discerning the effect. That is what strategic mold avoidance was based upon. If people are talking about Eric Johnson style mold avoidance under the umbrella of MT mystery toxin or discerning toxins, they are not actually talking about Eric Johnson mold avoidance. The only style of mold avoidance that Eric has created that he stands by is strategic mold avoidance to avoid the effect. So learning to feel locations and feel your environment and being able to stay out of the range of that effect is the goal and focus of strategic mold avoidance, because the longer you're away from the effect and the more time spent out of the effect, the faster and higher you climb the power curve, the more you can endure future exposures later. Not that you want to submit yourself to future exposures, but we do get to a point where we can kind of endure a little bit more as we climb the power curve. But if you can't stay out of range of what you're feeling from the effect, you are not going to be in a position to climb the power curve. And I think a lot of people get stuck there.
Yeah, after going through a bad building and having chemical sensitivity amped up, I became reactive to everything. So if I were to try to assign a name to every unknown toxin, everything that was slamming me, I'd run out of names. This was like a sensitizing agent, and it unveiled the potential for any chemical, anything that could be in the air, any VOC, any particulate, anything that was there that I normally wouldn't react to. If I suddenly start reacting to it, rather than giving it a name, I think of whether or not this is in the presence of a sensitizing agent or something that is unveiling something that shouldn't be bothering me. So for that purpose, I never give it a new name. I just wonder, is the bioavailable potential being unveiled?
That's such a good point. Thank you for pointing that out, Eric, because the effect is a description of how toxins, all toxins in general, are becoming more bioavailable. So it doesn't really matter what toxin it is. The problem is that it's suddenly become more bioavailable when it's in range of this effect, and staying out of the effect is still the primary focus. We have a really good class in our Patreon membership about developing your mold radar, but what the strategic mold avoidance actually comes down to is learning the stages of strategic mold avoidance so that you can empower yourself to do your own experimental assessment. It's not so that you're glued to somebody else where you have to ask the perfect location or ask how to do it. once you kind of learn these stages, you can have full control over your health by doing your own experiments. Trusting your senses is a really big part of this process. And I feel like trusting your senses through this illness gives sick people such a sense of empowerment. Once you realize that you were as sick as you really were, and all it took was for you to trust yourself and how you felt in your reactions to conquer that, you just feel like you have superpowers because you can avoid all trauma and drama just by trusting how you feel. And I think that that's so empowering in a social structure of sick people where they're like begging their doctors for tests, they're begging their family for validation. Forget all of that. Like, just rely on your own senses and trust yourself and empower yourself with your health. The way that the RV lifestyle of mold avoidance got started was Eric made a MICU, a mobile environmental control unit, so that he could get out of his bad environment, so he could control his environment. If where he was felt bad, he could get in this thing. He can control all experiment factors in terms of like what was inside it if it was contaminated, and he could get to a better area to see how he felt. So these are different levels of experimenting that you can use to check. You can get a suspected item away from you to see how you feel. You can get out of your house to see how you feel, but different experiments that allow you to assess what's happening in terms of your reactions. There's a ton of myths in mold avoidance, and there's even an entire, this cracks me up. This is embarrassing. If you created this group, or if you're in this group, you should be embarrassed of yourself. There's a group called, I don't know what it's called, but they're like debunking mold avoidance because you can't avoid all mold because mold spores are everywhere. Mold avoidance is not about avoiding mold spores. Mold avoidance is about staying out of range of the effect and understanding all of the factors connected to that so that you can regain your health. We know that mold is in the air all the time. We don't think that you should be dodging mold spores. We don't run from the sight of a little white fuzz on our shower doors or a little orange mold. Like, we're not avoiding all mold. If we see mold and we don't react to it, we don't pay attention to it. If we don't see something and we are reacting, we prioritize that because we trust how we feel. So anyone who's saying mold avoidance is impossible because mold is everywhere is kind of an embarrassment to the idea of mold avoidance, because they haven't even dug like 2 inches below the surface to find out that it's not even about avoiding mold spores. So some really great guides for beginners. The Beginner's Guide to Mold Avoidance book, Eric Style Mold Avoidance. Mold is everywhere. Mold avoidance is not possible. The one thing that we do want to bring up about these books is, so first of all, Eric didn't write these books. These books were written on his behalf, and he was like contributed credit because it was pulled from like his posts and his ideas. But one of the things that was kind of mistranslated here is the idea of mystery toxin. Eric didn't know what to call the effect because he doesn't have a name for it. And that got translated as MT, mystery toxin. And although it was only mentioned a couple times in these books, the theory and concept of MT has taken on a life of its own to where now people are like, well, I'm avoiding this area, it's high in MT. Well, that's not what mold avoidance is. It's a complete mistranslation. So that's not Eric style mold avoidance, just to be clear.
Well, if I can elaborate on that, I didn't think that the mystery toxin nomenclature would cause any problems because it's a mystery. It's a mysterious agent. We need to look into it, discuss it. But people didn't discuss it. They assigned it a toxic value and said, this is a particular toxin, a particular chemical. Whereas the effect that we're talking about is more of an electrostatic, radiomimetic type of feeling. So the more people use that nomenclature, anything that has the word toxin associated with it, the more they shift their thinking into purely focusing on chemicals. When I think there's something else that needs investigation, which is much more of an ion gradient, electrostatic type phenomenon.
People who do strategic mold avoidance tend to notice reduction or elimination in multiple chemical sensitivities, food sensitivities, energy levels. They tend to notice an increased immune system that might help put chronic infections or recurring infections or reactivated viruses in remission. They notice a lot less issues with cardiac problems or nervous system disorders. Basically, the symptoms that are labeled as different diagnoses, but are very often the result of mold hypersensitivity, will be reduced by following mold avoidance. And the longer and more accurately you do mold avoidance, the more success you are going to see in the reduction of your symptoms. We've created a membership group to kind of have more hands-on support for people who want to learn strategic mold avoidance and who want to learn more about the effect theory. If you want to join our membership group and have more connection, to discussing these ideas and dive deeper into this, that's what the membership group is for. We do have a platinum Patreon membership. Right now, it's like under $200. It includes all of our membership content and then also monthly consults. If you want to connect with us on any of those, just visit exposingmold.org for more information or to sign up.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a really great class today, webinar on strategic mold avoidance. I hope that we cleared up some misconceptions and also helped you develop your own keen senses. And maybe now you'll be more interested in doing your own self-assessments, experiments, to see how using your senses is actually the best way to help you through this issue of mold and help you reclaim your life again. Thankfully, we have had Eric in our corner to provide us information and guidance on what to do to save our health and also help us reassimilate back into society and not simply just live in an RV in the desert. And so we really appreciate you, Eric, for all of your hard work and your dedication over the years. And we're very honored to be able to transcribe and provide this information to our audience members joining us today. So if you'd like to stay connected, we are on multiple platforms, Facebook, Instagram. We also have a free podcast with so much free information. And we always love to continue these conversations on our social media pages. So please check them out. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll see you next time for our upcoming webinar.